On an ordinary workday in 1953, amidst the clatter of typewriters and the aroma of morning coffee, Sidney Gottlieb added a few drops of a colorless liquid to his colleague's drink. It wasn't an assassination attempt. It was an experiment. For the next 77 days, the CIA agent suffered from a severe psychosis that destroyed his career and mind. This was no tragic accident or side effect. It was the modus operandi of Project MKUltra: betrayal, secrecy, and a complete disregard for human life, even the lives of its own personnel. This raises the first question: why did the CIA, an agency with almost limitless resources, need to establish a network of clandestine brothels with two-way mirrors for its experiments? And a second, even more critical question: why, in 1973, did CIA Director Richard Helms order the destruction of absolutely all project documents if it was so vital to national security? They were attempting to conceal something so horrific that even its mention had to vanish. However, due to a bureaucratic error, approximately 20,000 pages survived. This was enough to expose a 20-year program of torture. By the end of this film, you will have 7 keys to the darkest secret in American intelligence. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a code we will break together to understand how the nation's protectors secretly became its tormentors. To answer this question, we must understand the logic of paranoia. How did a nation founded on the idea of freedom sanction a program of total control? At first glance, the answer is simple: fear. The early 1950s. American soldiers were returning from Korean captivity, publicly denouncing their country and praising communism. Newspapers screamed about a new Soviet weapon: brainwashing. Panic became state policy. It seemed the CIA had no choice. They were simply defending themselves. But the documents tell a different story. Fear became not the cause, but the permission. It was like exploiting a small crack in a dam. They channeled all the pressure of the Cold War into it to justify dismantling the entire structure of law and ethics. CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized the program with an unlimited budget and, more importantly, completely removed it from congressional oversight. This was the creation of a secret weapon. They needed not just an administrator, but an ideologue willing to cross the line. That ideologue was Allen Dulles himself. What compelled one of America's most influential men to personally approve a program that violated every conceivable law? He is often portrayed as a patriot who believed any means were justified to protect democracy. If we don't, they will. However, the reality was different. Dulles saw MKUltra not as a shield, but as a sword. He sought a way to neutralize enemy leaders, create puppet agents, and obtain information at any cost. On April 13, 1953, he signed the directive that launched 2 decades of experiments. His famous principle of plausible deniability became the project's foundation. He created a system where he could sanction illegal activities while formally remaining unaware. Dulles was the architect, but he needed an executor, a true dark sorcerer. Why did so many educated individuals, scientists, doctors, military personnel, agree to participate? They were told. The Soviets are already doing this. It's a matter of national survival. Victors are not judged. In an atmosphere of total paranoia, their choice seems understandable. Now put yourself in their shoes. You are the head of an intelligence agency. The enemy, rumor has it, has created a mind control weapon. You have only 2 options. First, adhere to the law and risk national security. Second, retaliate in kind at any cost. What choice would you have made in their position, knowing only what they knew? Their choice: any cost. And that choice determined not only the methods, but also the main tool they selected to crack the human mind. This tool was LSD. Why did the CIA bet on a little understood psychedelic instead of proven interrogation methods? When Albert Hofmann discovered its properties, psychiatrists saw it as a key to treating schizophrenia, a way to expand consciousness. The CIA was interested in the exact opposite, not expansion, but destruction. They realized that LSD's ability to induce temporary psychosis and erase ego boundaries was the perfect chemical key to cracking the human personality. Their goal was not to heal, but to break. And here's a fact that explains the scale of their ambition. In the early 1950s, The CIA, through front companies, bought up the world's entire supply of LSD from Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. This was akin to a single intelligence agency secretly acquiring all the planet's uranium reserves. This monopoly was entrusted to one man. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was a brilliant chemist, a PhD, and the CIA's chief poison specialist. But the facts contradict the image of a detached scientist. To test LSD, he secretly slipped it into his colleagues' drinks during work meetings. People who trusted him became his unwitting guinea pigs. He did this not in a sterile laboratory but over morning coffee, with the cold cynicism of a man who recognized no own people. If he treated his colleagues this way, what was he prepared to do to strangers? His ultimate goal was not merely to extract information. Gottlieb believed that the human personality could be erased, like a recording on tape, and then replaced with a new one, entirely controlled by the CIA. For Gottlieb, the human personality was akin to a clay tablet. His aim was not to read the text, but to create an acid capable of dissolving the clay itself. To achieve this, he devised a horrifying cocktail of drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and torture. Colleagues nicknamed him the Black Sorcerer. But his laboratory was too small. True magic required a larger stage. And this is where the logic breaks down. Sidney Gottlieb, a stuttering chemist, milked goats on his Virginia farm every morning before heading to an office where he approved plans for torture. He was a loving husband, father, and enjoyed folk dancing. In his mind, there was no contradiction. His work was simply a patriotic duty, a technical task of national importance. Declassified reports reveal how coldly he described the results, referring to his victims as material. This detachment was his most terrifying characteristic. While he folk danced, Operation Midnight Climax was unfolding in San Francisco under his command. How did a secret program escape the CIA's basements and spill onto the streets of American cities? Initially, logic suggested controlled environments, laboratories, and selected volunteers. But Gottlieb quickly realized that to create a true weapon, it needed to be tested in the chaos of the real world. He needed to know how LSD would affect a random person in a bar or an intimate setting. It was like cultivating a poisonous plant in a greenhouse, then scattering its seeds in a wild forest to observe how it would spread. He needed the perfect testing ground, a place where people were vulnerable and no one asked inconvenient questions. He found this testing ground in the brothels of San Francisco. The operation was named Operation Midnight Climax. It was the pinnacle of cynicism. The CIA established a network of safe houses in San Francisco and New York. Hired prostitutes lured clients, whose drinks were secretly laced with LSD. But these weren't just apartments. They were full-fledged observation laboratories. Behind two-way mirrors, in smoke-filled rooms, sat agents. Financial reports show them ordering martinis while watching unsuspecting individuals descend into chemical hell. They turned human tragedy into a spy show. Why brothels specifically? Because their clients were ideal victims. 3 factors made them so: vulnerability, silence, and a complete lack of public credibility. Who would believe someone who reported to the police that they had been drugged in a brothel? This was a cold, pragmatic calculation for impunity. The CIA didn't merely use prostitutes. They established a shadow network of drug addicts and petty criminals to find new test subjects. The operation was financed through front foundations, such as the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, to hide its traces even from other CIA departments. Did these cruel experiments yield any scientific results? On paper, agents collected data. They kept journals, wrote reports, creating the illusion of research. But from a scientific standpoint, it was utterly useless. There were no control groups, dosages were random, and the data consisted of subjective observer notes. Calling this science is like calling a street brawl a study of anatomy. The surviving reports reveal the true purpose. It wasn't science, but training. Practicing techniques, how to discreetly administer a substance, how to exploit a person's vulnerability while under its influence. One would think the scientific failure of the operation should have halted it. But Gottlieb drew the opposite conclusion. The problem wasn't the method, but the subjects and conditions. He didn't need a random brothel client. He needed a fully controlled individual. Not the chaos of the streets, but the sterility of a laboratory. Thus, the failure didn't stop the program, it expanded it. The MKUltra virus mutated, breaking free from the clandestine safe houses. It began to infect hospitals and prisons. They found their ideal victims where no one would look for them, and no one would believe their cries. The program began deceptively innocently. At universities, students were paid $20 to participate in psychotropic substance research. This created an illusion of legality and voluntariness. But this phase quickly ended. MKUltra expanded to 149 independent sub-projects conducted in 80 institutions, including 44 universities and 12 hospitals. Volunteers for such a scale were catastrophically insufficient. Therefore, they began to deliberately use psychiatric patients, prisoners, and drug addicts, those who could not give consent, those who could not complain. But the most brutal experiment was conducted not in the U.S., but in Canada. What happened within these projects? In Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron believed he could cure schizophrenia by completely erasing a patient's personality and then reassembling it. For the CIA, this was exactly what Gottlieb was looking for. In practice, his methods were torture. He would induce people, often diagnosed with anxiety, into drug-induced comas for months. For 30 consecutive days, while a female patient was unconscious, Cameron subjected her brain to electric shocks 40 times more powerful than standard therapy. He was attempting to literally burn out her personality. Many left the clinic with irreversible brain damage. But for the CIA, this wasn't a failure. It was proof that personality could be erased. How could dozens of respected institutions participate in this? Most didn't know they were working for the CIA. Money flowed through front organizations with respectable names, such as the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. However, financial reports indicate that some scientists were well aware of the source of the funds. They were enticed by generous funding and a complete lack of oversight. The system operated like an underground river. On the surface, only trickles of legitimate grants were visible, but beneath flowed a powerful current of CIA money, nourishing the entire network. However, this wasn't the only threat. The true goal of all this madness was even more terrifying. Why was all this necessary? LSD, brothels, electroshock. What ultimate goal justified such means? Officially, the CIA sought two things: a truth serum and protection against Soviet brainwashing. This was an understandable objective in the context of the Cold War. But in reality, they were seeking not a shield, but an absolute weapon. Their holy grail was the idea of the Manchurian candidate, an agent who could be programmed to kill, then have their memory erased. This chimera was the driving force behind the entire program. While society watched spy thrillers, the CIA was actually attempting to create a zombie agent. But how to create such an agent? LSD broke down personality, but it didn't provide control. So the CIA turned to an older technology, hypnosis. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, the idea of a human weapon, activated by a code phrase, seemed like the ultimate solution. They moved from theories to practice. One report described an experiment where a secretary, under deep hypnosis, was ordered to pick up an unloaded pistol and shoot a person she didn't know. She did so without hesitation. Upon waking, she remembered nothing but the cold weight in her hand and the smell of ozone, like after a thunderstorm. They were frighteningly close to their goal. But attempts to weaponize another's mind were only the beginning. The next step was the erasure of personality itself. It seemed like a failure. The human psyche proved too complex. The idea of a reliable puppet agent remained a fantasy, but were these experiments truly a failure? In the course of these searches, dozens of psychological pressure techniques were refined: sensory deprivation, extreme temperatures, auditory assault. It worked like reverse alchemy. They tried to create gold, a controllable agent, but instead accidentally produced the perfect acid, capable of dissolving human will. These findings formed the basis of the official CIA interrogation manual, Q-Bark. Esoteric experiments transformed into a documented state program of torture. This cynical approach inevitably led to tragedy when the system decided to turn it against its own. What caused one of the hypnotists, recruited by the CIA, to flee the project in horror? Initially, he was enticed by patriotism and unlimited resources. He believed he was serving science and security, but one day, he witnessed his therapeutic methods being used to break a person's will. He realized he had become an accomplice. His attempt to leave the project was met with veiled threats. He understood that he had become part of a machine comprising 149 subprojects and 80 front institutions, from universities to hospitals. One couldn't simply quit this work, but if even accomplices became prisoners, what awaited someone who was not just an employee, but a victim who knew too much? How did a project obsessed with control transform into an uncontrollable monster? Within the CIA, there was an illusion of safety. Experiments were conducted on enemies, not on their own people. Employees were operators, not targets. But as the project grew, so did paranoia. Any doubt or hint of dissent within the team was seen as a threat. The system began to see enemies everywhere, especially among those who knew its secrets. All these theories and the search for the candidate created a soulless machine that, when confronted with a real person from its own ranks who showed weakness, reacted with extreme programmed brutality. This machine found its ideal victim in one of its best scientists. His name was Frank Olson. Frank Olson was the ideal insider, a brilliant scientist, an expert in aerobiology, a loyal patriot. He believed in the CIA's mission. On November 19, 1953, at a secret meeting at Deep Creek Lake, his superior, Sidney Gottlieb, personally slipped LSD into a glass of Cointreau liqueur he offered to his colleagues. For Olson, it wasn't a psychedelic experience, but a descent into hell. He plunged into deep depression and paranoia. But most alarming for the CIA, he began to question the morality of his work and spoke of resigning. From a reliable asset, he transformed into an unpredictable threat. The system, intolerant of threats, had already prepared its own protocol for assistance for him. Under the guise of assistance, Gottlieb sent Olson to New York to see a top psychiatrist. He was accompanied by caring agents, but it was a trap. The doctor, Harold Abramson, was a CIA contractor, an expert in LSD and hypnosis. His task was not to help, but to assess the threat. Olson was placed not in a hospital, but in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel, under round-the-clock surveillance. On the 9th day, Frank Olson fell from the window. The CIA immediately declared it a suicide, closing the case. This signal was clear to everyone inside. No one was safe. While the CIA considered the story closed, the Olson family was just beginning its decades-long fight for the truth. For 41 years, the official CIA version remained unchanged, a tragic suicide amidst depression. In 1975, the agency even paid compensation to the family, admitting guilt for the experiment, but not for the death. In 1994, Olson's sons achieved an exhumation, and the body revealed the truth. Forensic pathologist James Starr's team discovered a massive hematoma on the skull, inflicted by a blunt object before the fall. Olson was unconscious when he plummeted. The expert's conclusion was unequivocal. He was thrown from the window like a sack of garbage. This evidence was the reason the CIA took its most desperate step. In the short term, the murder worked. The secret was kept, and Project MKUltra continued for another 20 years. But Olson's death left a ghost within the CIA, a constant reminder of what the system was capable of. This fear smoldered for decades. When the Watergate scandal made the threat of investigations real, it erupted in panic. It was the memory of the Olson problem that prompted CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973 to issue the order, "Destroy everything." It was an attempt to bury the ghost once and for all. But within the agency's colossal bureaucratic machine, a single error transformed this cover-up operation into the key to its full exposure. Richard Helms' order was simple: erase MKUltra from history. Boxes of documents related to the 149 sub-projects were retrieved from archives and burned. Truth turned to ash. But due to a bureaucratic oversight, the order never reached the Financial Accounting Department. Approximately 20,000 pages of invoices, checks, and contracts survived. This was the Achilles heel of the perfect cover-up, a stack of papers 2 meters high. It was these dry financial reports that allowed investigators to unravel the entire web of payments to universities, hospitals, and front foundations, thread by thread. Accounting became the chief witness for the prosecution. These documents were the key, but someone was needed who dared to turn it in the lock. On December 22, 1974, journalist Seymour Hersh published a front-page article in the New York Times about illegal CIA surveillance of Americans. MKUltra was just one thread he pulled. But that thread unraveled a giant ball of yarn. The publication caused a public outcry and led to the creation of a special Senate committee chaired by Frank Church. The investigation reached the highest level of government. At the hearings, senators listened in shock to accounts of trap brothels and the death of Frank Olson. The surviving financial reports were the commission's primary weapon against the evasive answers of former agents. And when the project's chief architect was called to the witness stand, everyone expected remorse, but instead witnessed a display of absolute impunity. The Church Committee's findings were staggering: the existence of MKUltra, LSD experiments, and the probable murder of Frank Olson. Justice seemed inevitable, but when Sidney Gottlieb was confronted with accusations, he cynically claimed he could recall almost nothing, as all his records had been destroyed by executive order. The order to destroy evidence became his primary defense. Ultimately, Gottlieb was not prosecuted. No one in the CIA's senior leadership faced criminal charges. For 20 years of experiments, torture, and at least one proven death, not a single CIA employee spent a day behind bars. The exposure occurred, but justice did not. And this lack of justice gave rise to a dark legacy that continues to affect us today. The exposure wasn't an end, it was an ellipsis. The lack of punishment and the program's shocking details generated profound distrust of authority. MKUltra transformed from a secret operation into an archetype, fuel for hundreds of conspiracy theories, films, and books. It worked like atomic fission, releasing an enormous amount of paranoia that still radiates through culture. The secret was exposed, the culprits named, but the fundamental conflict between a state striving for absolute control and an individual's right to freedom remained unresolved. The ghost of MKUltra still roams the halls of power today. So what, in essence, was MKUltra? It wasn't a mistake or an anomaly. It was a perfectly functioning system, ignited by a single spark. Fear of brainwashing created a moral vacuum that Sidney Gottlieb filled. His obsession with control spawned cynical methods like Operation Midnight Climax. This cruelty inevitably spilled beyond brothels onto the most vulnerable, patients and prisoners. The insane goal of creating a puppet agent made a tragedy like Frank Olson's death only a matter of time, and his murder, in turn, triggered a panicked cover-up operation. It was a 4-act tragedy. Fear begot a monster. The monster begot chaos. Chaos demanded a victim, and the victim's ghost forced the system to burn itself down. And yet, justice was not served. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who approved torture and murder, was never convicted. He retired peacefully, raised goats, volunteered at a hospice, and died in 1999. This contrast between his crimes and his peaceful old age is the ultimate verdict on the system. Victims and their families fought in courts for decades. In 1976, the Olson family was paid $750,000. It was a cynical price for a life broken by the state. But for most other victims, the system offered nothing, actively resisting all lawsuits. It not only failed to punish the guilty, but also refused to acknowledge its victims. MKUltra's primary legacy is not declassified documents, but a deeply rooted distrust of authority. The exposure of a real, documented conspiracy of such magnitude became a perpetual engine for paranoia. It permanently ingrained in culture the idea that the wildest theories could be true. The project's shadow is visible in film plots from Jacob's Ladder to Stranger Things. But what has changed since the 70s? MKUltra tried to hack the mind like a safecracker with a crowbar and brute force. Today's technologies act like a smart lock, to which we voluntarily provide the code by publishing our lives online. We fear LSD in a glass, but we don't notice the algorithms that shape our opinions every day. Ultimately, this story leaves us with two terrifying conclusions. First, people entrusted with power and operating in secrecy are capable of unimaginable crimes and can remain utterly unpunished. This is a lesson about the failure of control systems. Second, the ordinary person, their mind, and their rights are Incredibly vulnerable when faced with a state machine that has decided the ends justify any means. This is a lesson about the fragility of freedom itself. Now it's your turn to deliver a verdict. What is more frightening in this story? Write one word in the comments: the impunity of the project's creators or society's vulnerability to them.